The neighborhood had always been a quiet one, or at least, that's what I thought, when I first moved into my modest home on the edge of Maplewood Estates. Rows of tidy lawns lined the streets, each house practically a mirror image of the next. At first glance it seemed like the kind of place where people waved at each other on morning walks, borrowed cups of sugar without hesitation, and watched each other's kids when someone was running late. But beneath the manicured hedges and carefully trimmed grass, there was something far less wholesome simmering, something I wouldn't fully understand until I decided to put up a fence. I hadn't planned on causing trouble. The truth was simple. I wanted privacy. The back of my yard opened onto a stretch of woods, but one side was shared with my neighbor, a woman who everyone quietly referred to as the neighborhood hawk. Her name was Margaret, but most people knew her by a less flattering nickname, Karen. She was infamous for her complaints, her finger-pointing, and her endless reports to the HOA. Over the years she had tried to dictate the colors people painted their shutters, where they parked their cars, and even how long children were allowed to play outside. I had managed to stay out of her crosshairs during my first months in Maplewood. I kept my grass trimmed, my trash bins tucked away, and my driveway free of oil stains. But the peace didn't last. It began the moment the wooden posts went up along the edge of my property. The fence was simple. Nothing extravagant. I chose a sturdy 6-foot design, tall enough to give me privacy without overshadowing the yards around me. I liked the idea of being able to sit on my back porch without feeling like someone's eyes were constantly watching. But within a day of the installation crew starting their work, the atmosphere shifted. I could feel it, like a storm brewing in the distance. Karen was watching, arms crossed, lips pursed, standing just inside her yard line as if she were preparing to pounce. The workers noticed her too. They whispered to each other as they measured, dug, and leveled. She lingered by the corner of her yard, inspecting every move, scribbling something on a notepad as if she were documenting a crime scene. I pretended not to notice, but in truth, it unsettled me. By the time the final panels were installed, Karen had already made her opinion known. Though she didn't speak to me directly, I began receiving subtle hints of her disapproval. Neighbors mentioned that she had been concerned about the height. Someone else told me she was spreading rumors that I had built the fence illegally, encroaching on her property line. Then came the official letter from the HOA, a thin envelope with thick implications. The notice was sharp in tone, warning that my fence was in violation of community standards and potential property encroachment. It demanded that I take it down within 30 days or face escalating fines. My stomach sank as I read it, the words twisting like a knife. I had followed every guideline I could find, checked local regulations, and even measured carefully before construction. Still, here I was, being accused of breaking the rules. The weight of it settled on me. I had just spent thousands on the fence, not to mention the time and energy it took to plan. Tearing it down would be devastating. Yet as I reread the notice, I realized something important. It was vague. It didn't cite specific measurements or ordinances, only complaints. That meant the HOA was acting on someone's word, rather than hard facts. And I knew exactly whose word that was. For days I wrestled with frustration. I wanted to confront Karen, to tell her to mind her own business, but I knew that would only make things worse. She thrived on conflict, feeding off it like fuel. Instead, I decided to take another route, the one she didn't expect. I began digging through my property records. It took hours of phone calls and trips to the county clerk's office, but eventually, I had everything I needed spread across my kitchen table: deeds, plats, surveys, and boundary maps dating back decades. With a ruler and a magnifying glass, I traced the lines, compared the measurements, and double-checked every figure. My heart raced as I realized the truth. Not only had I built the fence well within my property, but the actual boundary line extended a few feet further than either of us realized. Karen had been claiming the edge of her yard for years, planting flowers and shrubs right up against the line. But those inches, those small strips of land, technically belonged to me, and I had the paperwork to prove it. It was a revelation that shifted everything. I no longer felt cornered or defensive. Instead, I felt a surge of quiet power. For once, I held the cards. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Karen wasn't the type to back down. If anything, presenting her with facts would likely enrage her further. I needed to be patient, strategic. The HOA had given me 30 days to comply, but what they didn't know was that I had 30 days to prepare my counterattack. The nights that followed were restless. I often sat awake, listening to the hum of the crickets outside, staring out at the fence that had sparked this silent war. Each panel stood tall and sturdy, a barrier not just of wood but of principle. It wasn't just about privacy anymore. It was about standing my ground against someone who had pushed too many people around for too long. I began gathering testimonies from other neighbors who had dealt with Karen's interference. Some were hesitant at first, but once I explained what was happening, they admitted they'd been through similar ordeals. She had tried to dictate one man's Christmas decorations, called the HOA on a teenager for parking slightly too close to the curb, and even demanded that a woman repaint her front door because it clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. One by one they shared their stories, and I tucked each one away like ammunition. The clock was ticking, and the stage was being set. Karen thought she had won, that her complaint would bully me into submission, but what she didn't realize was that the fence was just the beginning. As the final week approached, the HOA sent a second letter, firmer than the first. The threat of fines loomed larger, the tone colder, more official. But by then, I was ready. I had a binder full of documents, testimonies, and irrefutable proof. When the day came to meet the board, I would not be the one standing accused. What Karen didn't know was that by poking at me, she had stirred something far stronger than her usual tactics. This time, she wasn't just up against another neighbor. She was up against someone who had the truth on their side. And as I looked out at that fence casting long shadows across the yard in the fading evening light, I realized something else. This wasn't just about defending my property. It was about exposing Karen for what she truly was, a bully who had finally met her match. The battle lines had been drawn. And soon, the real fight would begin. The letter from the HOA had arrived like a summons, cold and formal, instructing me to appear before the board at the community center. They had scheduled it for a Saturday morning, when they knew most residents would be free to attend. It wasn't just a private meeting. It was a performance, staged in front of an audience of neighbors who would watch and judge. That was how the HOA worked in Maplewood Estates. Their power came not only from rules and fines, but from the public shame of being called out before the community. And that was exactly what Karen wanted. The morning of the hearing, I woke before the sun. My binder of documents sat neatly stacked on the kitchen table, each paper organized with tabs and notes. I had deeds showing the property lines, survey maps marked with precise measurements, and even highlighted sections of the HOA's own guidelines, which proved I had not violated any rules. My preparation was complete, but my stomach churned with unease. I knew that truth didn't always win in situations like these. Karen had influence. She had spent years worming her way into the ears of board members, presenting herself as the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards. When I arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already half full. Clusters of neighbors gathered near the entrance, some chatting idly, others clearly waiting for the show. Inside the long rectangular room was arranged like a courtroom. A row of folding tables formed the board's bench, where 5 members sat in neat formation, papers spread before them. At the far side, a cluster of chairs formed the audience section. In the center was a smaller table, reserved for those brought before the board. That table was mine. Karen was already there, seated proudly in the front row of the audience, her posture stiff, her face set in an expression of grim satisfaction. She clutched a folder in her lap, stuffed with papers she likely believed would seal my fate. Her eyes followed me as I walked in, cold and calculating, like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble. The chairperson of the HOA called the meeting to order, running through a few minor agenda items before arriving at mine. Then my name was spoken aloud, echoing through the room, and all eyes turned toward me. I walked to the center table, my binder in hand, and sat down. The spotlight was on me now, just as Karen had intended. The complaint was read aloud in stiff, formal language. It stated that my fence exceeded allowable height restrictions, encroached on neighboring property, and violated community aesthetics. As the words spilled into the room, I could feel the weight of the accusation pressing down on me. The board members exchanged looks, some skeptical, others sympathetic. They had likely heard this kind of thing from Karen before. Then the chairperson invited Karen to present her evidence. She rose from her seat with exaggerated poise, striding to the table as if she were a lawyer about to deliver a closing argument. She spoke of property values, of quote, community harmony, and of how my fence allegedly robbed her of light and space. She waved papers around, though most were nothing more than printouts of generic HOA guidelines. She pointed to photos she had taken, carefully angled to make the fence appear taller than it truly was. To anyone unfamiliar with the facts, her performance was convincing. Whispers spread through the audience. Some nodded along with her words, while others exchanged weary glances, clearly familiar with her theatrics. The board listened politely, jotting notes as she spoke, their expressions carefully neutral. When she finished, she sat back down with a smug smile, clearly believing she had secured victory. Now it was my turn. I placed my binder on the table and opened it to the first tab. My voice was steady as I began, though my heart pounded beneath my ribs. I laid out the facts one by one. First, the HOA guidelines themselves, highlighting the clause that permitted fences up to 6 feet in height. Then the property records, showing the official boundary lines as recorded by the county. Finally, the survey maps, complete with measurements and coordinates, proving that not only had I built the fence within my property, but that the true property line extended farther than Karen had ever acknowledged. I didn't stop there. I spoke of the history of her complaints, carefully noting the many neighbors who had endured similar accusations. Though I didn't mention names directly, I hinted at the pattern, suggesting that this was not an isolated issue, but part of a larger problem. Each point was methodical, deliberate, undeniable. The room shifted as I spoke. The whispers grew louder, some tinged with surprise, others with amusement. I caught glimpses of neighbors in the audience nodding along, their expressions turning against Karen. Her smug smile had vanished, replaced by a tightening of her jaw and a nervous flicker in her eyes. She had expected me to crumble, but instead I was dismantling her case piece by piece. When I finished, I slid the binder across the table toward the board. They leafed through it, scanning the documents with furrowed brows. The chairperson asked a few clarifying questions, which I answered calmly, citing the precise page and section for each. The more I spoke, the clearer it became that the evidence was overwhelmingly in my favor. Karen, unable to remain silent, suddenly interjected. Her voice rose sharply as she tried to dispute the survey maps, claiming they were outdated or inaccurate. She accused me of manipulating the documents, of twisting the facts. But the board quickly shut her down, reminding her that she had already had her turn to speak. The outburst only made her look desperate, a sharp contrast to the calm precision of my presentation. The chairperson called for a short recess so the board could deliberate. As they left the room, the audience buzzed with conversation. I sat quietly, my hands folded on the table, while Karen fumed in her seat, whispering angrily to herself. Every so often she shot me a glare, as though sheer hatred could undo the facts I had presented. When the board returned, the decision was swift. They announced that my fence was fully compliant with HOA guidelines, and that it had been built within my property lines. The complaint was dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, they issued a warning to Karen, reminding her that false or frivolous complaints wasted the board's time and strained community relations. The words hit her like a blow. I could see the redness creeping into her face, the way her hands tightened around her folder until the papers inside crumpled. For once, she had not only lost, but been publicly scolded. The audience murmured with approval, some even clapping lightly before the chairperson silenced them. The meeting adjourned soon after, but the damage had already been done. Karen stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, while I remained seated for a moment, letting the victory settle in. Neighbors approached me afterward, some offering quiet congratulations, others simply smiling as if relieved to see someone stand up to her. But as I walked back to my car, binder still in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She had been humiliated in front of the very community she sought to control, and that kind of wound ran deep. The battle over the fence had been won, but the war with Karen was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed the HOA hearing, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm again. The fence stood tall and untouched, just as I had intended, casting its long shadow over the boundary line each morning. I had won, and the victory was more than personal. It was public. Everyone had seen it happen. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of Maplewood standards, had been overruled and reprimanded. For a moment, it felt as though her reign of control had ended. But if Karen was anything, she was relentless. Losing publicly hadn't broken her spirit. It had ignited something darker. I could sense it in the way she carried herself whenever our paths crossed. She no longer met my eyes, no longer spoke to neighbors with her usual forced cheer. Instead, she simmered in silence, her bitterness visible in the tightness of her smile and the sharpness of her glares. She had been embarrassed, yes, but humiliation can breed vengeance, and I was quickly becoming her sole target. It started subtly. One morning, I found my garbage bins overturned, their contents scattered across the driveway. At first I thought it was raccoons, but the placement was too deliberate, too neat. The bags were ripped open in straight lines, not claw marks. I cleaned it up, unsettled but unwilling to jump to conclusions. A few days later, I noticed tire tracks cutting across the edge of my lawn, deep grooves that hadn't been there before. I hadn't parked there, and no delivery truck had come down that path. It was as though someone had driven deliberately across my grass, just enough to scar it. Then came the letters. Anonymous notes slipped into my mailbox and tucked beneath my door. They were typed in blocky font, no handwriting to trace, each one accusing me of being a bad neighbor or threatening that my attitude would not be tolerated in Maplewood. They dripped with the kind of venom that made it impossible to ignore, and though no signature was attached, the tone was unmistakable. Only Karen had the kind of seething anger that could fill a page with such petty malice. I tried to brush it off, but the attacks escalated. A complaint was filed against me for leaving my porch light on too late at night. Another accused me of storing unauthorized materials in my backyard shed. Each time, the HOA sent their standard notices, and each time, I replied with evidence that the accusations were baseless. Still, the pattern was clear. Karen was determined to bury me in complaints, hoping that if she threw enough dirt, something would eventually stick. The neighbors began to notice too. Some avoided the subject altogether, wary of getting caught in her line of fire. Others whispered quietly when I passed, sympathy in their eyes but fear in their voices. They had seen her tactics before, but never this concentrated, never this personal. I had become the example, the one she was intent on making suffer. One evening, as I sat on the back porch, I thought about the absurdity of it all. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about control, about power. Karen had thrived for years by intimidating people into compliance, by making them bend to her will. But I had stood up to her, exposed her for the bully she was, and she couldn't forgive me for that. She needed to reassert herself, to prove she still held influence. The breaking point came when I discovered the damage to my fence. It was subtle at first, a loosened post, a small crack along one of the panels. I thought it might have been weather or simple wear. But then, one morning I found an entire section leaning at an unnatural angle, the nails pried halfway out as if someone had tried to dismantle it by hand. My chest tightened as I ran my fingers along the splintered wood. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. I documented everything. Photos of the damage, copies of the anonymous letters, records of the bogus complaints. My binder grew thicker with each passing week, no longer just a defense against false accusations, but a growing case against Karen herself. Still, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to march across the lawn and confront her directly, to demand she stop. But another part of me knew that was exactly what she wanted, to drag me into a shouting match, to create a scene she could twist into another complaint. So instead I stayed patient, I waited. And then, opportunity presented itself. It came in the form of a delivery driver. One afternoon, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a small delivery van parked awkwardly near Karen's curb. The driver, frustrated, was explaining to a neighbor that the package he was supposed to deliver was missing from his truck. It had been scanned as delivered, but there was no sign of it. The package, he said, belonged to me. Confused, I checked my porch, my mailbox, and the side of the house. Nothing. Later that evening, I noticed something odd in Karen's backyard. Through the slats of my fence, I could see a cardboard box tucked beneath her deck. It was partially hidden, but the shipping label was visible in the faint glow of her patio light, and there it was, my name, my address. My pulse quickened as I realized what had happened. She had taken it. Whether out of spite or sheer pettiness, Karen had crossed a new line. Property damage and anonymous notes were one thing, but theft was another. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a crime. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I took photos. I documented everything once again, and with each click of the camera I felt the balance shifting back into my favor. She thought she was untouchable, hidden behind her facade of neighborhood concern, but I had proof now. Real proof. The next morning I returned to find the package sitting on my porch, as if it had been there all along. No note, no explanation, just the box. But the cardboard was damp with morning dew, far too fresh to have been outside overnight. She had placed it there early, likely realizing she had gone too far. But she didn't know that I had already seen it, already captured the evidence. The stage was set again, though this time it wasn't the HOA I planned to turn to. Karen had escalated beyond their jurisdiction. She had turned her vendetta into theft, and that was something that could not be dismissed with a warning. As I sat at my kitchen table that night, flipping through the growing binder of evidence, I realized something important. Karen thought she was orchestrating this war, pulling the strings and setting the pace, but in reality, she was digging her own grave, one petty act at a time. And I was no longer just defending myself, I was preparing to end this once and for all. By the time autumn leaves began to fall across Maplewood Estates, my binder had become more than just a collection of documents. It was a record of Karen's obsession, a catalog of her malice. Page after page, each photo, letter, and official notice formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. What had started as a neighborly dispute over fence height had spiraled into harassment, vandalism, and theft. And as I flipped through those pages late one evening, I realized that Karen had given me everything I needed to finally put an end to her campaign. But it wouldn't be simple. The HOA had already scolded her once, and while that public embarrassment had bruised her ego, it hadn't stopped her. She operated in the shadows now, her attacks more subtle, her methods harder to trace. Still, I had caught enough to build a strong case. The question was no longer whether I could prove what she was doing. It was whether I had the patience to let her dig her hole deeper, or whether I should strike now. The package theft weighed heavily on me. Watching my own name and address printed on a box hidden under her deck had been the clearest proof yet that she was willing to cross legal lines. She had returned it the next morning, pretending it had been there all along, but that didn't erase what I had seen. I considered going to the police right away, filing a report with the photos in hand. But I hesitated. A part of me wanted her downfall to be bigger than that. A petty theft charge might teach her a lesson, but it wouldn't dismantle the power she wielded in the neighborhood. I wanted something permanent, something undeniable. So, I waited. The next escalation came sooner than expected. One morning, as I drove out for work, I noticed a bright orange notice taped to my fence. It was another HOA citation, claiming that my lawn was out of compliance due to excessive debris. My jaw tightened as I read it. My lawn was immaculate. I had mowed it just 2 days earlier, bagged the clippings, and kept everything tidy. But when I returned home that evening, I found the source of the complaint. Trash had been scattered across my yard. Empty soda cans, crumpled fast food wrappers, and even a few plastic bags littered the grass near the property line. It was deliberate, staged to look as though I had neglected my home. I could almost picture her sneaking over in the night, arms full of garbage, grinning as she tossed it into my yard. I didn't clean it up right away. Instead, I photographed everything, time-stamped the images, and added them to the binder. Only then did I gather the trash into a bag and set it aside. The HOA citation joined the stack as well. Neighbors began to murmur. A few asked quietly if I was all right, hinting that they had noticed strange things happening around my property. Others kept their distance, wary of being dragged into the feud. I could feel the tension spreading across the street, invisible lines being drawn. Some sided with me, frustrated with Karen's endless policing, while others stayed silent, afraid of becoming her next target. Karen, meanwhile, carried on as though nothing was wrong. She strolled her yard with her usual air of superiority, pruning her rose bushes and waving at passers-by. But beneath her carefully painted smile, I could sense the unease. She knew I had proof. She knew I had seen the package. And yet, she kept pushing, as though daring me to act. Finally, I decided to take the next step. I began organizing the binder into sections, transforming it from a pile of evidence into a weapon. The first section outlined the original fence dispute, complete with the HOA's dismissal of her complaint. The second section documented the harassment, letters, false reports, and citations that had all been disproven. The third contained photos of the vandalism, the overturned garbage bins, the tire tracks in my lawn, the damage to my fence. And finally, the fourth section focused on the theft, complete with clear photos of the package hidden beneath her deck. With the binder complete, I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board. I didn't want to ambush them during a public hearing. This time, I wanted them to see the full scope of her behavior in private, without the theatrics of a crowd. The board gathered in the small conference room at the community center. Their faces were polite, but wary, clearly expecting another tedious complaint from one neighbor about another. But as I laid the binder on the table and walked them through each section, their expressions began to change. Skepticism gave way to surprise, and surprise shifted into concern. They lingered on the photos of the package under Karen's deck, passing the pages between them with furrowed brows. The theft had struck a chord. HOA politics could dismiss complaints about lawns and fences as petty disputes, but theft was criminal. And the binder showed a pattern of behavior that painted Karen as more than just difficult. She was dangerous to the peace of the neighborhood. When I finished, the chairperson thanked me quietly and promised the board would take action. There was no need for me to file another response, no need for me to attend another hearing. They had everything they needed. I left the meeting feeling lighter, though not entirely relieved. Karen wasn't the type to surrender easily. Whatever action the board took, I knew she would retaliate. The difference was that this time, I wasn't alone. The board had seen the truth, and the community would soon follow. The first sign came a week later. Karen received her own official letter, hand-delivered by the HOA. She read it on her porch, her face tightening with each line. From across the street, I watched her crumble the paper in her fist and storm back inside, slamming the door behind her. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Whispers floated about fines, sanctions, even the possibility of legal involvement. For the first time in years, the power Karen had wielded seemed to falter. Her once commanding presence shrank, her walks around the block less frequent, her head no longer held so high. But while the board's letter was a blow, I knew it wasn't the end. People like Karen didn't simply stop. They adapted, shifted their tactics, found new ways to lash out. She was cornered now, and a cornered enemy is often the most dangerous. One evening, as I sat on my porch, binder still resting on the table beside me, I looked at the fence that had started it all. Its panels glowed in the orange light of the setting sun, sturdy and unmoved, despite everything she had thrown at me. It stood as a reminder that I had endured, that I had refused to bow. But as the crickets began their nightly chorus, I felt a gnawing sense of anticipation. The HOA had stepped in, yes, but Karen wasn't finished. She was plotting, waiting for her chance to strike again. And when she did, I would be ready, because I had learned the most important lesson of all. In a battle with someone like Karen, the real fight begins after you think you've already won. The morning after the tense HOA meeting carried a strange stillness in the neighborhood. For the narrator, it felt like the eye of a storm, quiet but unnervingly fragile, as if the slightest gust could send everything spiraling again. The previous evening had ended with the revelation that the fence stood firmly within his own property line, yet the truth had only fueled Karen's outrage rather than dimmed it. Karen, never one to admit defeat, had stormed out of the clubhouse with her fists clenched and muttering threats under her breath. That image lingered in his mind as he stepped outside to collect the morning paper. The fence stood exactly as it had before, strong, straight, and unyielding. It was no longer just a barrier between yards. It had become a symbol of defiance against bullying and manipulation. But Karen's presence was not one to vanish easily. Her house, directly across from his, stood with its curtains drawn tight, as if she were plotting inside, scribbling strategies on invisible paper. And indeed, before noon, the rumblings of her next move made their way through the gossip channels of the HOA. A neighbor passing by on their morning walk whispered that Karen had been making phone calls since dawn, spinning tales of a dangerous, non-compliant fence and rallying sympathy from her dwindling circle of allies. The narrator knew what was coming. Escalation. Karen had lost her grip at the meeting, but she would try to reclaim it by sheer persistence. By midday, evidence of her new campaign was visible. Brightly printed flyers appeared in mailboxes and taped to community notice boards. They bore alarming claims that the fence posed a hazard, that it was an eyesore lowering property values, that it encroached upon shared neighborhood aesthetics. Each flyer dripped with exaggeration, but they carried Karen's unmistakable tone of indignation. She was attempting to turn the neighbors against him, to paint him as selfish and disruptive. Most residents ignored the flyers. Some even rolled their eyes at the predictable theatrics. But a few, weary of drama, began to mutter about neighborhood harmony and whether the fence was worth all this conflict. The seed of doubt, no matter how small, was what Karen thrived upon. The narrator refused to let that seed grow unchecked. That evening, he quietly reached out to several neighbors, not with anger or retaliation, but with calm transparency. He showed them the same documents presented at the HOA meeting, walked them through the property maps, and reassured them that the fence complied with both HOA bylaws and city regulations. His measured approach contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic attempts to rally a mob. While Karen sowed panic, he offered clarity. Still, the tension weighed heavily. Days passed in a strange limbo. Every trip to the mailbox, every car pulling into a driveway, felt like part of a larger chess match. And then, one afternoon, Karen revealed her boldest move yet. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew his attention as he worked in the yard. A pair of unfamiliar men in reflective vests approached, clipboards in hand. They introduced themselves as city code inspectors, sent to evaluate a complaint lodged against his property. Karen, it seemed, had reported the fence to the city, escalating the matter beyond the neighborhood's internal politics. The inspectors were polite, professional, and thorough. They measured the fence, inspected its foundation, and compared it against zoning ordinances. Their demeanor carried no malice, only procedure. But Karen stood a few yards away on her own driveway, arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. She watched like a queen awaiting the downfall of her rival. The narrator, though nervous, knew the truth would stand. He had built the fence to code, filed the appropriate permits, and even consulted a surveyor. When the inspectors concluded their review, they offered a simple statement. The fence complied with every regulation. No violation existed. Karen's smile faltered. She pressed the inspectors with questions, grasping for loopholes, but they offered none. Their final words were firm. The case was closed. They departed, leaving Karen fuming in her driveway while the narrator returned to his home with a renewed sense of victory. But even then, the battle was not over. Karen's humiliation deepened her bitterness. That night, neighbors reported seeing her pacing on her porch, ranting into her phone. Some speculated she was calling lawyers. Others suspected she was plotting another round of flyers or HOA complaints. Her determination to make the fence vanish bordered on obsession. The narrator, however, began to sense that Karen's crusade was unraveling. Her reputation, once feared and influential, was tarnished. More neighbors voiced their frustration at her antics, complaining that her obsession was draining the community's spirit. The HOA board, embarrassed by the spectacle, began quietly distancing themselves from her. Even her closest allies seemed reluctant to engage in her latest schemes. And then came the breaking point. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the cul-de-sac, a heated argument erupted outside Karen's house. Her voice, sharp and shrill, carried across the yards as she berated a fellow board member who had dared to suggest she drop the matter. Her words tumbled into accusations, insults, and even threats. Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. For the first time, the community witnessed Karen not as a crusader for rules, but as a tyrant unraveling in her own fury. Her authority fractured under the weight of her own outburst. The neighbor she shouted at stormed away, muttering about resigning from the board. The crowd dispersed in uneasy silence, but the damage was done. Karen had exposed herself as unreasonable, unstable, and consumed by personal vendetta. The narrator, watching from his porch, realized the tide had turned. Karen had tried every tactic: intimidation, manipulation, bureaucracy, but none had worked. The fence still stood tall. The community, once wary of challenging her, was beginning to see through her facade. Yet, he also sensed that the final chapter of this battle was approaching. Karen was cornered, and cornered people often acted unpredictably. She had lost the HOA, lost the inspectors, lost her grip on the neighborhood. The only question remaining was how far she would go before her reign finally collapsed completely. The calm of the evening felt deceptive, like the hush before thunder cracks the sky. The fence stood strong, but so did Karen's determination. And as the neighborhood held its breath, waiting for the next move, the narrator prepared himself for the inevitable climax of the struggle. The storm was not yet over. The days following the HOA's ruling against Karen felt like the lifting of a storm. For months, the tension in the neighborhood had been palpable, every walk down the street shadowed by Karen's glares, every friendly conversation with a neighbor laced with hesitation in case she overheard and twisted words to her advantage. But now, with the board's official decision in my favor and her violations stacking against her, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Karen, however, did not retreat gracefully. Her obsession with control did not dissipate after being proven wrong. Instead, it seemed to fester and twist into something even more bitter. She no longer had the HOA board firmly behind her, but she still had her voice, and she used it. Every morning, she could be seen pacing her yard, talking loudly to anyone who would listen, or even to no one at all, ranting about how unjustly she had been treated, about conspiracies she believed were brewing within the HOA, about neighbors she claimed were plotting against her. Some neighbors began avoiding her altogether, crossing the street to stay out of earshot. Others gave me sympathetic looks whenever I stepped outside, their unspoken support a small comfort. Yet, despite the ruling, Karen seemed determined to find a new way to make my life difficult. I suspected she was looking for loopholes, small cracks she could exploit, hoping to drag me back into another exhausting cycle of complaints. It didn't take long for her next attempt to materialize. One morning, I found a fresh notice taped to my mailbox, this time from the city's zoning office. Karen had filed a complaint alleging that my fence obstructed sightlines for drivers turning onto the street, supposedly creating a traffic hazard. It was a stretch, and anyone who had driven the road knew it wasn't true, but she was grasping at whatever she could. The zoning inspector scheduled a visit, and when he arrived, he quickly saw through her accusations. The fence was well within code, far back from the road, and in no way obstructed visibility. He shook his head, apologized for the inconvenience, and left. Still, it was proof of how far Karen was willing to go, filing baseless claims simply to wear me down. What she didn't realize was that every false claim, every wasted inspection, was creating a record. A paper trail that painted her as a chronic complainer. A neighbor whose credibility was eroding with each desperate attempt. And the HOA board had begun to notice. During the next meeting, the president openly addressed the issue of frivolous complaints, making it clear that homeowners who misused official channels for harassment could face fines or even legal consequences. Though no names were mentioned, everyone knew who the message was directed toward. Karen's composure began to crack. The more she lashed out, the less support she had, until even the few neighbors who had once tolerated her antics stopped coming to her defense. The walls were closing in, but she refused to admit defeat. She doubled down, holding her phone up to film me whenever I worked in my yard, muttering under her breath about evidence. She even tried once more to approach me directly, standing on the sidewalk and yelling across the property line about how wrong I was, how the board had been manipulated, how I would regret not listening to her. I didn't engage. At that point, silence was my greatest weapon. Every attempt she made to provoke me only backfired, reinforcing to the neighborhood that she was the aggressor. My refusal to bite back left her shouting into the void, her words carrying less and less weight with each outburst. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I returned home one afternoon to find a city code enforcement truck parked outside Karen's house. From across the street, I saw 2 officers walking her yard, pointing at her overgrown hedges, the peeling paint on her garage door, and the makeshift shed she had erected, without a permit. Apparently, the HOA's accumulated complaints against her had finally been escalated to the city level. She was cited on multiple counts, each carrying fines that would add up quickly if not addressed. For someone who had built her identity around policing everyone else's property, it was the ultimate irony. She had spent so much time nitpicking the details of my fence that she had ignored the growing list of violations in her own yard. And now, the very system she had tried to wield as a weapon had turned against her. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about how Karen had been fined, how she might even face liens if she didn't resolve the issues. Some took quiet satisfaction in her downfall. Others shook their heads at the spectacle of it all. For me, it was vindication. Not just that I had been right all along, but that justice had caught up with her in the end. The following weeks were filled with a strange silence from Karen's side of the fence. No more shouting, no more notices, no more frantic attempts to rally support. Her yard became strangely still, as though she had retreated inward, unable to face the humiliation of her defeat. The neighborhood itself seemed to exhale, the tension lifting, leaving behind a newfound sense of peace. In time, the fence became just another part of the landscape. Neighbors complimented it casually when passing by, remarking on how well it suited the property. Children played in the yards without fear of being scolded, and conversations flowed more freely at community gatherings without Karen dominating the room. Life began to resemble what I had always hoped for when moving into the neighborhood. a place where people could simply coexist without needless battles. As for Karen, she never apologized, never acknowledged her mistakes. That wasn't her way. But her power was gone, her influence stripped away by her own actions. She had wanted to control the neighborhood, but in the end, she only managed to isolate herself. The HOA, once a tool she wielded, now kept her at arm's length, treating her complaints with skepticism rather than urgency. Standing by my fence one quiet evening, watching the sun dip behind the houses, I realized the fight had been about more than wood and property lines. It had been about boundaries, respect, and the right to stand your ground when someone tries to push you beyond reason. Karen had tested those boundaries, but the truth had prevailed, and the tables had turned. In the end, the fence stood tall, not just as a barrier of wood and nails, but as a symbol of resilience. It reminded me that sometimes, the best response to relentless opposition isn't to tear down what you've built, but to hold firm, to trust the truth, and to let those who thrive on control unravel under the weight of their own obsession. And as the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm, free from Karen's relentless scrutiny, I knew one thing for certain: the fence was never the problem. It was the line she couldn't cross, no matter how hard she tried.